Thank you for joining us for 3Bs on the Law podcast, hosted by Trisha Barita, Camille Canali, and Susan Dawson. Disclaimer, this podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.
Hi everybody, I'm Camille and I'm the California Bee.
Hi, I'm Susan and I'm the Illinois Bee.
Hey, I'm Trisha and I'm the Texas Bee.
So teleworking is a huge issue right now, and I know one of the issues that a lot of employers are having is, should we bring our employees back? Should we let them stay home? Who should be allowed to stay and continue to telework from home? And what do you do when an employee tells you they're scared to come back? It's a huge issue right now, and we've been discussing it, and we thought we would share some of our thoughts with you. I know, Trisha, you had said there's a lot of concern with the new EEOC guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, for, in Texas under the Fifth Circuit, accommodations for telework isn't something that normally the employer was required to do. So telework as an accommodation, which the EEOC has sort of come out there and said that they think that it should be considered to be an accommodation for individuals that may have higher risk to COVID-19. That kind of changes the game down here. There's a lot of employers that maybe had never teleworked that are now looking at a whole telework force and trying to figure out how to work that out. Of course, you can have part of the workforce be telework or part not, or do the whole workforce. Some jobs are not telework and have never been telework. And I think that's kind of a huge concern when you're trying to figure out if the individual that has a job that's never been teleworked, how do you consider whether or not you give them, employers give them an accommodation? What would the accommodation be? What if telework isn't an option, like because the person needs to be there physically to do something interactive, and now all of a sudden that individual maybe is more susceptible to having a higher risk COVID-19 case? They would be looked at as potentially wanting to stay home. The employee wants to stay home. The employer maybe wants to give them that opportunity, but the telework isn't in the job description to begin with. So I think that those kind of issues really are a problem. I mean, how do you guys see it? I mean, how do they move them to a different position? You're always concerned about doing that and debating about whether or not the employee really is all on board with that.
Well, I think you want to look at whether or not the employee can actually perform the essential functions of their job via telework. I mean, I think that has to be one of the considerations that you do, and that's why it makes it so important that you have job descriptions for each of your positions so that you can analyze whether or not they actually can perform those essential functions at home if they need to.
I think it's important to think about how the EEOC has repeatedly through the whole pandemic emphasized the need for flexibility on both the employer and the employee side. So it's not a 100% telework or 100% in the office. There might be, these are the duties you need to do in the office, so you'll come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 2 hours.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. No, the issue with whether or not you're going to choose to have that employee have different job duties, maybe another option, kind of exploring, if they, want to be teleworking, if we give them a different position, or maybe, like you said, a partial, telework situation, which if that can be explored, that would be great. Maybe they come in off hours where the employees aren't around, so they're less susceptible to being exposed to individuals. I think that all those things can kind of help. It's not an easy thing, because if you've never had a telework workforce, this looks weird, and it can be generational, I think, different to where like certain generations see it differently, right? If you're not in the office, you're not working.
Right.
And that's it's not always generational, because I think that's just also sort of work semantics and how people feel about work. But that's sort of another management issue to overcome as well, I think.
I feel many businesses have already adjusted to telework, right? So the concept of whether or not we can have employees teleworking and how to do that's been worked out a little bit, but they all thought it was temporary, right? And so now they want people to come back. And people are saying, but wait, I've been teleworking for months and it was just fine. Why do I have to come back? And many business owners and executives that I've talked to, they miss having in-person meetings. And they say, well, if this person isn't in the room, now I have to remember to send an email to them to let them know what they missed. And, it's adding more work. It's adding more hassles. We're not together. We're not having those meetings. And so there's this challenge of the employees saying, I'm afraid, I don't want to come to work. And the employer saying, yes, but you're just not as productive. And the company is not as productive without in-person time. So, and we don't know how to answer that. We don't really know what the courts or how they're going to come down. I mean, let's think about that. What is the analysis? What are the questions that the employers need to be asking when they're going through that interactive process, they're going through the accommodation analysis? What are some of the questions that you've been kind of talking to businesses about that they should be thinking about?
And there's exposure there, right? Like we just don't know how big the exposure is, right? I mean, California over there with Camille is going to probably look a little different than it does over here, right? And right. So, and like I said, the Fifth Circuit's come down on, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and said accommodation is not an always requirement. So if the employee comes in and asks for an accommodation and they want telework, and it's not in the cards. It's not something that's ever been there for that position. It's not something they've ever provided. They're maybe not going to get it. Now, EOC sort of, changed all this guidance. Now, does that mean the Fifth Circuit's going to agree with them when it all kind of plays out? Like, who knows? But I think it's kind of a little confusing as far as the employers trying to sort all this out, because this is an unprecedented time. And I know that we've been talking about, but when we're talking about these EOC guidelines, we're talking about their special guidelines they put out here under these pandemic rules. So while the CDC is declaring this a pandemic, we're under these pandemic rules. And so I almost feel like the courts will have to give some deference to them on that, because somebody had to give guidance, and, the courts can't step in and start, legislating. So What do you think? What do you think, Camille?
I think there's going to be a whole lot of litigation over this. And I think that's why, we do recommend that employers try to be as flexible as possible. And I think it makes the argument of bringing people back to work, if teleworking has been ongoing and the people have been able, again, to perform their essential functions of their job duties at home, I think it makes it very difficult for an employer to make an argument to not grant an accommodation of staying home. But obviously, it has to be done on an individual basis for each person based upon their job description. And I mean, if half of their job duties have been knocked out because of COVID and the company can't continue to run unless that person comes in and is able to greet customers, for example. For example, you have an employee that does half online sales and half, in-store sales. That could be a difficult judgment call to make. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I think there's going to be, a lot of lawsuits over these issues, at least in California. What about Illinois?
Oh, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits in Illinois as well. It's a challenge. I've been recommending to businesses to keep people teleworking as much as they possibly can, even though it's we just for that very reason. But, I think about what, putting in, we were talking about this earlier, Camille, about putting in measurements, right, for productivity. I mean, the struggle that I'm seeing is in the beginning of the pandemic, many employees, especially employees that lived through or were workers in 2009, 2010, they were busting their butts, right? Because no one wanted to lose their job, and very efficient getting things done, working, really diligently. And now the weather's getting nicer. We're kind of getting used to this. Maybe school's out. And I'm hearing lots of businesses say people aren't as productive as they used to be. They're not getting the work done that they used to. Okay, great. Prove it. You know, we have to be able to you're going to have to be able to establish this somehow. You need to look at the job and come up with some benchmarks, right? And you know, what do you think about this? I've been saying to some of these businesses, there's no reason why you can't give them a written warning if they're not doing their job just because they're teleworking during COVID. You still can have a conversation with them and say, you're not being productive. You can still have a written warning. You can still do all of those things. And if they're not doing their job and truly you can establish it, we can talk about more serious ramifications to that. But, you know, so let's not forget employers, right? You still can run your business. It's just, we have to be flexible with this teleworking. You know what I'm saying? But I struggle the most with the employees that say that they have just no reason. You know, I live in a home with someone who's over 65, so I can't telework. Well, no, you're not at risk, right? I mean, in the EEOC has kind of fluctuated a bit. Do you feel that there's been, in the beginning, there was very clear, just because someone in your home is over 65, that is not a reason why you shouldn't go to work, right? If you're an essential business. Now it seems like there's a little bit more flexibility. Is anyone else seeing that?
You know, I think I'm a little concerned because I think public policy is going to come down ultimately on the side of the worker.
Mm-hmm.
And how that is
especially in California.
How that is going to affect all of these things. I don't know the answer. I don't think anybody knows the answer. We know what all the plaintiffs' lawyers are going to argue. A bit more flexible.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think we can't worry about the lawsuits at this point. The lawsuits are going to come or they're not going to come. I think at this point, you just have to look at what's out there, kind of figure out.
They're going to come, Trisha. They're not going to come.
It's not that. I just meant that.
We just don't know what direction, right? What creative they're going to get in those lawsuits, right?
I mean, you can worry about it as much as you can worry about getting COVID-19. Okay, like if you worry so much, you stop running the business, you stop taking care of the employees, other things fall through the cracks. What I meant was, I guess that yes, the lawsuits will come. We don't know what any of that looks like. There's obviously going to be litigation, you know, unprecedented, I'm sure. But I think what the employers have to do always is go back to, if they're trying to figure out, you know, whether they should be allowing people to take leave or to have accommodations like telework, you know, it always is going to be looking at whether or not you engaged in some type of interactive process to determine if there were other solutions that were a better fit. What if you can bring that individual back, but they're in a separate office and they're very low exposure, and maybe the employee's happy with that? Because on the other hand, while telework has become a big deal as a potential accommodation, the EOC sort of put out there, they don't want anyone not to be able to come back to work. So an employer can't jump to leaving people at home either if they want to come back to work. And so I think it's kind of a weighing sort of thing. And I think that's the key, like, for what I think is that interactive process, and not jumping to the end and documenting that you participated in that conversation with the employee. I think that'll kind of be key in looking at whether or not everybody acted reasonable in the situation.
Right. And that's the whole key, is how reasonably, or were you reasonable? I think that's ultimately the situation. So what do you do? Let's say you have 20 employees and they start finding out that one wants to stay home and all of a sudden the other 19 want to stay home, and you can't, because of the way the business is run, you can't have all 19 at home. What do you do? And you didn't know I was going to put you on the spot, did you, Trisha?
Are you putting me on the spot? I didn't realize. I think it's going to depend on the industry and the business and whether or not they're really truly not positions. So your job descriptions will come in handy there, Camille, and actually looking at it. If it's an expense thing, of course, we all know that expense is not going to be the hands down undue hardship to not give into that, right? So if it's just a matter of, can you get the computers, the phones at home for them, that's not going to probably get you there. You're, as an employer, you're really going to have to look at the whole situation and say, okay, no, literally the business can't run without, these particular positions being here. And I think that's kind of where that analysis is going to have to go. And I expect that that's where I'll see, at least on the Fifth Circuit side, I see that analysis occurring here,
Well, at least in Illinois, they're still saying if you can stay home and telework, stay home and telework. So I think to the end of what you're saying, Camille, is if there's some aspect that requires in person and suddenly no one's willing to do it because one person asked and now they all want it, I think that's going to be a great defense of there is this component and they're all asking to stay home. I could have accommodated one or two, but I can't accommodate all 20, right? So therefore I could accommodate almost no one, or I had to put on a rotation or something to that extent, right? Because you can't accommodate everyone. I'm curious about when you think about the interactive process, right? There's the old rule that a lot of employees forget sometimes that they have to engage in it too. Right. They think of it's just the employer has to come up with something. And what I'm seeing is employees that are just saying, no, I'm not coming in. And there's no interactive process. I'm not coming in. And then the employer says, well, what if you came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays? No, I'm not coming in. Well, that's not engaging in the interactive process. And we have no guidance on what is required on the employee side, other than the EEOC consistently saying even the employees have to be flexible, right? But in a disability situation, which is not what we're talking about here, even though we're talking about interactive process, in a disability situation, if the employee refused to engage, then we don't have to accommodate because they refuse to engage, right? Well, so what do we do here with COVID?
Sorry.
Why are you laughing at me?
I'm not. She's out laughing at me because I almost interrupted you.
No, I was laughing because Camille's going to be like, well, wait a minute here in California. Let me just lay it out for you.
Right. In the country of California.
I was going to say, so go on.
Step back, Chicago.
No, I know, right. No, I'm just curious. It's employees seem to have this feeling right now that they can just say no. Not all of them. Many employees are working, but you get the bad egg that is just saying no. And I don't know how that'll fall, because while we're talking about interactive process and we do have to engage in it, we're also not talking about disabilities, which is usually the only time you see interactive process. So it's going to be interesting, but I don't know. And it's just, we do the best. Like you said, Tricia, I think you said it perfectly. You can't worry about where the lawsuit's going to come from. You just have to make the best decision you can make at the time and keep your business going. As long as you go right.
And document.
Right. Document. As long as you go back to the basics and you think it through. Okay. It's just like anything else. What are the essential functions of the job? Can I accommodate reasonably? What does that mean for my business? Right. And if you can, you probably should, even if maybe it's not maybe you don't like it so much because you can't have in-person team meetings. Right. But if you can't, run your business.
Right. Honestly, this is all about risk management, right?
Right.
Thinking about the lawsuits. It's all about risk management, and it's also about having employee morale. That's a huge component that we haven't even talked about that I think has really affected companies who usually have a very interactive workspace. And those interactive workspaces, like, they're all the rage, especially with the millennials.
Right.
They're a big deal, and that is completely gone away. And so part of the function of coming back to work is also separate and apart from any legal issues. It's a morale issue. And I don't know what you guys have heard about that, but I know, we try to have a Zoom meeting with our whole team at least once a week. And, some of the staff members, they have it every day. And so we can check, really, it's not only so we can see how they're doing and see how deadlines and things are going, but it's so we can see how they are, and see who maybe is struggling and who needs some help, and, who maybe needs a little bit better workstation, and, all those ergonomic things that come up. Right. That people necessarily think about when somebody is hunched over their dining room table.
Right.
On a 12-inch laptop instead of a huge computer monitor that they have at work. So,
right.
And that's a good point, because some of the things is, yeah, they may want to telework, but it may not be comfortable for some employees to be pushed into the telework situation. Like you said, they may not have the equipment. How does that work with some employees that have a better setup at home to kind of transition in that? Does it affect morale? I would think that it does. And, people aren't really going to maybe, bring that up. And so that's kind of a thought that employers should kind of take into account, that there's things outside of, just the legal stuff. There's, of course, the morale issues. I think that's a great point, Camille.
Yeah.
And also, because in California we're crazy, but there's also the workers' comp issue you have to consider, because employers here have a catch-22. Because if an employee is injured at home because of their work equipment, because they trip over a computer cord, you've got a workers' comp issue. But if you bring them back to the office and God forbid you have someone who gets COVID, it's presumptive that they got it at work.
Right.
Workers'
right.
comp. So, I don't know how your states are with respect to the workers' comp, but you don't want to be the employer fighting that presumption.
Well, what you're talking about with people leaning over their desks and maybe not having all their stuff. Let's talk about increased carpal tunnel, people. I mean, right? It's, yeah, I can see that there's just a lot of issues, but I take it back to, I think you go through the questions, what's best for your business, and do the best you can.
So what do you guys think? I don't know. What are the reimbursement requirements where you guys are? Because that could also, I think, in terms of this reasonableness and creating, you have to show an undue burden if you don't want to provide the accommodation typically. And I suspect that because of the downturn in business, a lot of businesses who 6 months ago, a new computer or a laptop may not have been an undue burden, for a small business, it very well could be, to allow their employees to. That's
our other guest.
Right. Our mystery guest.
That's my guest right there.
Yeah. My mystery guests were barking earlier, so it's your turn, Camille. Yeah. This is the joy of sheltering at home, right? Of running, instead of recording a podcast from the office, we're all at home, right?
Everybody loves a four-legged friend, so it's all good.
So Illinois, in its just desperate attempt to become the next California, did pass a law similar to what you guys have in California, where we have to reimburse. And in the beginning of all of this, the EEOC was talking about, if people need equipment at home to work at home, you got to give them the equipment, right? So, there's a lot of costs associated with it. I've got to believe that a lot of businesses that didn't have people working from home have no idea that they should be paying for a part of their internet, that they should be paying. Do they have to get a new router? Do they have to increase their bandwidth to be able to do their job from home? Right? What bills are associated? How about their cell phone? Now everyone's using their cell phone. If you had a job where no one could use their cell phone at work, now everyone's using their cell phone. How much of the cell phone bill do you have to pay? And it needs to be paid. Now in Illinois, there's some rules about reimbursement. You have to submit the expenses. If you don't submit the expenses, it's not automatic that you get reimbursed and all of that. But if you have a company that never had that policy in place and you haven't been informing the employees of how to request reimbursement, yep, you're in trouble, so it's going to be, and I think California's law goes even further than Illinois, correct? I mean, you have some questions about utilities reimbursement.
Well, that's one of the questions I've heard posed, and it's kind of gone down. I've heard both answers. Do you need to reimburse for electricity? I mean, if the employee can show their electric bill went up substantially when they started working from home, and it went down when it was over, there may be an argument there. I don't know I don't know what the answer is going to be on that.
I think that's interesting that in line with the expenses and the kind of touching on policy issues with that, as far as the communication with these employees, like, it is a bit more work, right, to communicate with them. And so, as you're communicating these issues of, okay, how do we know we were supposed to expense them back something because we didn't know? And how do we make sure, we have the right policy in place and you draft that or whatever for the employee to acknowledge? And the same, there's a lot of other things that the employers should consider, communicating to the employee, like trying to contain some sort of control over the situation so that it's not like out of control when you have someone teleworking, which for new employers exploring telework, while they may have gotten everyone hooked up at home and properly online, and they're doing their weekly Zoom meetings, there's still a whole other array of how do you communicate, how do you discipline off that, and sort of getting some reporting or something back from the employees. I think it depends, of course, on the job, but I think when you brought this up earlier, Sue, that you were saying, hey, there's sort of this, I don't know if it's a fear of discipline, when telework is new, and how do you get past that?
Yeah.
I think it's important to communicate and document. And I think, it's always fine the first time to call up the employee and say, hey, this is an issue. And if it's not immediately resolved, and by the way, you should document in the employee's file that you called them.
Right. Right.
But then to have a more serious, conversation with the employee. I don't think that there's anything wrong necessarily with maybe, the velvet hammer as my civil pro.
What?
Your civil pro or your civ pro?
My civ pro teacher always would say it's the velvet hammer. So you're punishing them, but you're putting a nice soft touch.
I've never heard that.
Velvet hammer.
Oh, no. Yeah. I have very fond memories of my civ pro teacher, our professor in law school. Yeah.
But it didn't quite come out right. But
he never said that one.
But I don't think there's anything wrong with having a nicer conversation initially, because it's new to both of you, and
right,
everybody's kind of testing out the waters right now.
Communicate expectations, right? So that people aren't being caught unawares or by surprise. Yeah. Yeah.
I think this was good. I think this was a good conversation on telework. Is there anything you two want to add that we haven't kind of talked about?
I absolutely think that we got to talk about wage and hour.
All right.
You know what I think? Wage and hour is a very long conversation, and maybe that should be our next podcast.
I love it.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us on today's podcast of 3Bs on the Law. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We also welcome any comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us or suggest a future topic, you can email us at 3THREEBsonthelaw@gmail.com. And because we're lawyers, we need to remind you that this podcast is not meant to provide you with legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.